one of the things we aren't taught in school is we're not taught about money.
No, not at all.
And
it's a scandal, if you ask me. I think it's scandalous. When you onboard any person from Web 2 to Web 3, you're not just opening a wallet for them. The effective onboarding comes with financial education. That's the part that has been missing. If now billions of people have similar knowledge about financial systems, that to me becomes the antidote for financial abuse. Why would you exist in a Web 2 paradigm where you're making literally pennies on the dollar when you should be receiving your fair share of value, which is what's happening in Web 3. So that is the meaning of the open universe. And if you're not in it, then I think you're really sort of not seeing where the future is, because virtual work, I think, is the future anyway.
It's not a new thing. This is just us, but now represented digitally, and it's only going one way.
Where are we spending our time? We're spending our time digitally. Owning our data, owning the derivative of our data is so critical, and people don't understand that, especially in this age of AI. Because after all, AI lives off our data. We are feeding the AI. You wouldn't have ChatGPT or self-driving cars if it wasn't for our data. And how much are we getting paid for it? Big fat zero, right?
You're giving away your data and someone's selling it back to you.
That trade of that data commodity has always been locked until today.
Do you think the fight for digital property rights is the most important fight of the human species?
I would definitely consider it as foundational. What we're building is bigger than us. If you don't have property rights, you can't have freedom. If you can't have the ownership of it, then you can't predict the future for it. If you can see your future, then you can build towards it, and you're naturally optimistic. If you can't see your future, that's, I think, where trouble begins.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go? This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Yat Siu, the entrepreneur, investor, business leader, and gaming pioneer. You started your career at Atari Games at the tender age of 13 and went on to found the digital media development company Outblaze. In 2011, you co-founded Animoca, which provided gaming applications to the emerging smartphone market and has since become a world leader in entertainment, gamification, and blockchain innovation. To date, Animoca has invested in more than 400 companies with the goal to build an open metaverse based around blockchain technology in which users can buy and trade digital assets in the form of NFTs. Your ultimate plan is to build a global company that can, in your words, deliver true digital property rights for all. You believe that Web3 gaming is only scratching the surface of what's possible, and that in the future, completely new gaming models will be developed as a result of digital ownership. You've also said that Web3 and crypto can save the capitalist narrative by reintroducing the value of democracy. Yat, welcome back to London Real.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure last time, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Can't wait to jump into it. Great to see you. I saw you 2 weeks ago in Texas as we hung out with Captain Kirk himself, William Shatner.
That was legendary. Absolutely legendary. That was amazing. Amazing.
I was looking at you and me and I thought, who's the bigger fanboy? And I couldn't tell, right?
Yes.
Because I guess he really meant something to us growing up, right? He kind of...
I think, William Shatner, as in Captain Kirk, the real Captain Kirk, shall we say, he represented sort of a view of the future, right? In terms of what we saw, the concepts weren't only just on technology, which was very cool. I think about things like the tricorder, or basically predating things like, what we have with an iPhone and touchscreens and that idea. Or, for instance, instant translation, which is basically something that we can basically do today, for instance. But also values, right? Think about I think it was Star Trek that had the first interracial kiss. right? Which was scandalous and
1966.
Exactly, right?
Really?
And then relationships with aliens and sort of strange things like that, which were completely taboo topics, but brought it into the conversational frame to a level where today we may still talk about it, but it's completely sort of part of our society, part of our culture. So they really pioneered in more than just a show that talked about technology, but really, I think, touched many ideas of humanity that is sort of science fiction, but no longer fiction.
Yeah, it's so important, those things. And I was watching it on the plane to Texas, and there's actually AI components in there. Because he
Absolutely.
goes, computer, can you tell me this about this? And the computer
right.
goes to the database and gives him an answer. And I was like, that's AI, that's ChatGPT.
That's right.
And I didn't notice that a year ago.
Yes, exactly. We didn't think about it that way. But
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it was pretty cool. Hanging out with him was cool. I know you gifted him an NFT and he's posted it on Twitter.
That's right.
So,
I mean, I gifted him a Mochaverse, and that Mochaverse, had specific elements. It's a Mochaverse that was holding a keyboard. So it's a little bit sort of, about technology in the future, and had sort of a rocket space look, basically, which is really what, I think he did for a lot of people to think about science and to think about sort of the future and to think about space and the possibilities, right? The symbol of a rocket is progress, right? And that really, I think, is what he gave to people. Outside of, those who were around to see the landing on the moon, I would argue that Star Trek inspired a lot of people to look at the future in a totally different way.
Yeah, very much so. Well, I'm waiting for my Mochaverse NFT, so just send that over when you're ready. I'm a little jealous. But yeah, he was big for me growing up for so many reasons, and broke so many barriers and subconsciously planted so many ideas in our brains that changed society. I mean, I would argue more than any other television show of that era.
Yeah.
And great hanging out with him. And he's still curious, still asking questions. He was dropping...
Incredibly lucid. Incredibly lucid. We had some great
92 years old. Yeah. Great conversations. He was dropping his digital collectible with Orange Comet, one of our portfolio companies.
Yeah.
And he's still curious, still out there. I mean, he just went up in Bezos's spaceship last year as well. Yeah. I mean, that's me at 92. So I want to jump into everything, but I want to remind everybody that in November 21, it was you that first explained the metaverse to me. I didn't get it. I had been in the blockchain space heavily for like 6 months, and I was having a hard time getting my head around it. You came remotely at the time, and you really brought everybody up to speed. So thank you for that. You came back a year later when you were here at Token 2049, right when FTX dropped. And we were trying to process all of this kind of, you call it kind of like the crypto Wall Street behavior.
Yes.
And we were processing that. Now we're forward another 6 or 7 months. And I was wondering if you could tell me, what is the state of the metaverse? You always blow my mind by reminding me that like 3.4 billion people play games. I know you said that gaming is the predominant form of culture for youth today. And I left my 2 boys this morning. They're 5 and 6 years old. And as I walked out of the house, they were playing games. And if they're not playing games these days, they're watching other people play games.
Absolutely.
And it's not because I told them to or asked them to. And it reminds me, that's what I did as a kid too. And so I think it's easy to forget as adults sometimes how important gaming is and how maybe it represents the future of this entire Web3 space. So for people that don't understand that, how do you start that explanation, and where are we right now with Web3?
So maybe let's talk a little bit about what we think of the open metaverse as a sort of primer, right? We think of the open metaverse as a space in which we have actual ownership, right? The whole concept of digital property rights. And there's a very big distinction, not to confuse it with the metaverse as was defined by Facebook, right? Which a lot of people still think it is. So they think of the metaverse as something that's, a 3D virtual reality with immersive experiences, and you put something on your head and suddenly sort of you teleport into the metaverse. That's not the metaverse. That is an interface to the metaverse. But actually what you're experiencing is really an alternate reality that is real to you because the virtual world is effectively already real to you. In Asia, for instance, where I live, most of the time I would say, depends where, and I've been traveling a lot, people spend about 9 hours on average a day online. Think about that. That's basically most of your waking hours that you're online. When you're waking up, I think the study is that within the first 15 minutes, you grab your phone or you grab a digital device. Where do you go? Yes, you might look at something on the phone, but you've already traveled into a virtual realm. So your time and attention is already there. But the distinction is that the open metaverse is one where we own our time, where we own our data, where we have property rights around it. That space, which is known as the open metaverse, which is powered by blockchain, is what we collectively call as part of Web3. Last year was over a $30 billion economy. Now, just to put that in context, $30 billion economy is a bit bigger than the GDP of Iceland and Cyprus and 100 other countries. The reserves of this open metaverse, which is basically community-owned treasuries, was about $12 billion. Now, $12 billion is roughly smaller than the fiscal reserves of New Zealand. So what's happening is that there's an actual country that is already in the virtual economical space that's developing, where people are making real income, being employed, having actual capitalist opportunities that are developing from this, many of them from developing countries that were unbanked, but also in places in Europe and in Asia and so on, as they engage in these systems. All of this obviously is empowered from banking infrastructure that is DeFi, right? And last year, DeFi was over $100 billion of basically reserves, if you will, that was locked in the financial ecosystem. It's come down a little. I think it's maybe 60 or 70 billion today. But just to give you another comparison, I think the Federal Bank of New Zealand has $102 billion, for instance, right? So we're talking about national level economies that are basically building up from that. And that's the open metaverse. And that's only growing. One statistic that blows a lot of people's minds, because to us, NFTs are the representation of these digital property rights as we have them in the physical world, is that it was $24 billion of sales of NFTs that happened in 2022. And what's really fascinating is that, there's only a small number of people, we're talking, max millions of people that participate in that space. But of that $24 billion, 90% of its value went to the creators and owners of these NFTs. Spotify, in that same year, only did $7 billion in royalties. But it serves hundreds of millions of users. All these users own nothing, so they got nothing. And the creators / really, if you think about them, publishers, pocketed the remaining and then paid peanuts out to their artists, typically speaking. So that is, the state of this. So from our perspective, why would you exist in a Web2 paradigm where you're making literally pennies on the dollar when you should be receiving your fair share of value, which is what's happening in Web3. So that is the meaning of the open metaverse. And if you're not in it, then I think you're really sort of not seeing where the future is, because virtual work, I think, is the future anyway. We're already working at home on a computer. I mean, we're not actually physically doing, at least in developed countries, physically doing physical labor anymore. So even though we're not thinking of ourselves as maybe virtual employment, actually, does it really matter that you're physically in this office in the same way? You're remotely connecting with people, whether it's over Zoom or whether it's over Slack or whether it's over email. You're already a virtual being, and you can be anywhere in the world and you conduct your work. And that's really just the next step of engagement, where you then go from this quasi, I'm sort of in the physical world, but I'm also having this interface, into basically full immersion into that space, where all value is generated from this. And this is why Web3, and specifically crypto, is so fascinating. Because the medium of exchange in the open metaverse is going to be entirely crypto. And the other thing that's fascinating, of course, is when you think about something like AI, which become these autonomous agents in these games, like with these NPCs and so on, what are they going to be dealing with? They're going to be transacting in crypto. They're not going to open a bank account and do KYC in the traditional sense. They have to be authorized, but they're just basically going to go ahead and trade stuff over crypto. This paradigm of what's happening in the gaming world, but like you mentioned about your children, last year, something like $100 billion was spent in Web2 gaming items, right? And they were all trinkets, skins. They were cosmetic in nature. They were whimsical in nature. And really, if you think about that, that's a mirror of what we see in the physical world. When you think about us buying clothes and fashion, we're not buying them for utility. We're buying them because they make us look good or they make us feel good. It's part of our identity. We buy these things to represent meaning about us. And that element of culture in the physical world is really already happening in the digital world, but in a manner where we don't own anything. And that's why the open metaverse, Web3, and blockchain enables us to own these and create all the capital formation sort of possibilities that wasn't possible before in Web2, but is now possible in Web3.
And you've talked about culture being like one of the biggest single drivers of economies in the world.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think it's in like high single digit percentages. It's something we don't think about very much.
Because it's so in our life.
Yeah, and like you said, I've heard you say this before, that when we make choices for shoes and clothes, and if it was just utility, we'd all pick the same thing.
Exactly.
And yet we spend ridiculous amounts I think you said the more people spend on shoes, the less comfortable they are.
Well, more. I mean, some may debate that. However, definitely there is no direct proportional value in the cost of the shoe relative to its performance of the shoe in the traditional sense. Like a very comfortable shoe would be very cheap, perhaps, right? But a very expensive shoe is not necessarily the physical comfort, but it gives you a sense of yourself. Like you feel good wearing it. And how do you express that feeling? That feeling isn't a logical feeling because humans aren't entirely logical beings, right? We have emotions, we have desires, right? We're built in this manner, so we buy things that make us feel or look good. In the physical world, we also do self-expression in different ways. I mean, this may not have been socially accepted in the past, but today, for instance, people, wear sort of earrings, people do piercings, people wear tattoos, right? I mean, what is that? A tattoo is really, if you think about it, in the virtual sense, a kind of a skin, right? That is basically closer than just, something that you put on, or people color their hair. I mean, I don't think there's much of a difference really. It's another form of self-expression, except you can do it much more rapidly and you can explore much more faster in the metaverse because of the fact that you have these devices where you can actually explore yourself in a manner that perhaps you couldn't do physically, not just because of the physical limitation, but perhaps because of societal behavior or because of other things that you can freely express online that you can't actually express physically. So I think of this as, like it's already happening. It's already there, and you need to sort of at least understand it. Because, I may have given this example before, but if I had told, for instance, if in my mom's generation, I would have told her that we would be worshiping superheroes, right? and basically, those type of icons, people flying in the sky and basically sort of conquering some alien monsters, and that was what we were looking at. She'd be like, what is this? Why would we care about this stuff, right? Or that we were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on things like Birkin bags and expensive, Hermes items and so on. They would have said, this is insane. Where we are today is exactly what we do today. Everything is related to sort of a self-expression and our identity. Culture is, in our view, the biggest TVL of any economy. Because culture,
total value locked.
Total value locked, like
right.
in crypto terms.
In crypto terms.
But in economic terms, it just means that it's stuff that you sink into the economy because of identity, because of different purposes outside of utility. For instance, whether it's a wedding ring, or maybe even the place you buy, or certain items that you have, these are things you will never sell, right? They mean something to you. It's not because they're perishable, it's because they're special to you. And then you buy them, and they become part of your legacy. And that legacy identifies not just your identity, but travels down the identity of your entire family. I mean, think of those. Why are we obsessing about ancestry? And why do we care about our legacies and backgrounds? Because again, we're exploring about who we are. Like, what's my background? Okay, there's a national identity. But then beyond the national, there is also the sort of, my history, my family history, my background. And I need to be reminded or reinforced on these physical things. In the digital space, we couldn't do this until Web3 and blockchain. Now I can literally pass on my legacy that's digital, that's permanent on, but with one major difference: no size limitation. Mm-hmm. I am not restricted. I can keep all these things. Maybe this tradition is kept less in the Western world, but for instance, in places like Asia, particularly in Japan, your home often, your ancestral home, is just something you don't sell, right? You own it because there's a legacy, there's a history that comes down from a history that says, where you're from. And so therefore you simply can't sell that. Unless you have to, right? And it feels different. I mean, imagine for those people who bought their first home, built something in their life, and yeah, commercially it makes sense to sell, but what does it make you feel? Most people will have an emotional reaction to that. It's not logical, right? Someone's paying you more money? Of course, upgrade. But you leave something behind when you do that. And that's basically what property rights does for us, and it's culture. And that is what we invest and develop in. And because of culture, we have things like movies, and we have things like television, and we have people employed in the space, which has then caused an industry to create flat screen TVs, or PlayStation, or Xbox. Like, imagine if we didn't have culture in the world, there would be no retail, there would be no sort of technology, right? Think about just what the gaming industry spawned. The reason the gaming industry spawned high-performing GPUs, which basically, if you think about it, is one of the things that the crypto community basically ended up riding on for proof of work in the early days.
Yeah, right? and AI now.
And AI now, exactly, right? So it's the history of human creativity and innovation often begins in very whimsical ways. And this is, again, when we talk about this debate about humans versus AI, is that a human person will do something for their own pleasure that entertains them, that doesn't come from a natural form of logical utility. I mean, think about the history of creating musical instruments. I mean, some person somewhere in the world had to decide, well, okay, let's make an instrument because it sounds nice. It wasn't for utility. It wasn't to sort of bring order to something. It was just nice to listen to. It was just beautiful. Or art, whether it's cave paintings or whatever. It's not logical, right, when people make these paintings, but they tell their own story, and that's an element of that creativity. And then it leads to something else. One of the sort of more fascinating stories is the very first typewriter was known as the writing harpsichord, because the innovation of the piano, which was a musical instrument, had this keyboard mechanism. And then they created, basically, you can look up it online, you can see that the very first typewriter, which eventually led to a system that would lead to the computer and the personal PC as we see today, started from the keyboard of a harpsichord, which was basically the predecessor of a piano. Right? And you'll find many cases in history, whether it's automatons or other things like this, where the innovations that we experience today come from whimsical and creative experiences that are very human and have nothing to do with practical utility. And now we have the PC and we have the computer that has a keyboard that really started from a musical instrument.
Wow. So we need to just understand that culture is a major driver of much of what we do on this planet.
Everything we do, I would say.
Yeah, that's why I love it when you come here, because you always remind me of things that are right in front of our eyes, but we don't always see. And I was thinking about this morning. I mean, I wear these three-piece suits that are done by an English tailor. I wasn't born here. I was born in San Diego, California.
Yeah.
And yet I do it, and because it links me to the past, and I understand it now. I'm now part of this. And if I think about all my actions, from the decor in the studio to the gong you just hit.
The flag. Right?
Yeah.
What is the flag?
Yeah.
Right? Exactly.
It's culture.
Yes, absolutely.
And it drives all of this innovation. And sometimes it's easy to forget that, right? Because it's also, everyone has their own individual culture.
And it's just so in our life that we see it every day. Right. It's a little bit like as a parent, when you see your kid grow up, you don't really know how quickly they grow up. But in my case, unfortunately, because I do travel a lot, and my youngest is still in Hong Kong, and when I see him, he's suddenly like several inches taller. I'm like then you feel like, oh my goodness, I've missed something. But when I'm there with him the whole time, during COVID, for instance, and he grows, but I don't see the growth the same way, because it just happens progressively and you don't notice it, right? So I think this is just one of those things where you have to often step back and just sort of marvel and sort of appreciate the growth around you.
Yeah, I think it was Terence McKenna said that, I don't know who discovered water, but it definitely wasn't a fish. And so we're submersed in culture, and sometimes we still can't see it. You once said profoundly that Bitcoin is a store of value, NFTs are a store of culture.
Yes.
That was really powerful when I reread that this morning. And a lot of people that, wrote off NFTs after OpenSea went up and went back down, and the prices of Bored Ape went back down. When you say something like that, I guess that's a reminder that there's so much more going on here than a JPEG price that went up and down, that a specific metaverse over here that people are using or not using.
Correct.
And that's trying to remind people that it's not a new thing. This is just us, but now represented digitally. And it's only going one way, which is
because
more.
Where are we spending our time? We're spending our time digitally. I think the other thing is that when people talk about sort of, the metaverse is dead and that kind of stuff, actually, it's more what they see as Facebook's meta, right? So Facebook's meta has created this easy narrative to declare it dead because they said the metaverse is dead. However, when you look at it, the facts, when you think of the combination of Web 2 and Web 3 universes, that includes platforms like Minecraft and Roblox and Fortnite and Sandbox and so on as well, then you have something like 600 million people in those type of immersive environments. It's hardly dead, right, for instance, right? But it's how you define it and think of it. And if you're not in the space, and I think this is where Facebook has done an incredible job. They've, in our own little bubble of Web3, we easily dismiss it because we know it's not real. But outside of that bubble, people actually do believe that Facebook's meta is the metaverse. And that's what they've managed to capture. Therefore, Facebook's failure to execute on the metaverse, which we always said would be super difficult for them because of the fact that it was closed, for instance, and wasn't built on Web3 and blockchain, that to me is what other people see. And they see outside and they say, it's easy to say, oh, look, if Facebook failed, then how can it possibly be real? because they, again, haven't explored it properly.
Well, so let's talk about this with a couple examples. First of all, you did a TED Talk recently,
yes.
which is the big TED, as I used to say, not just the TEDx.
Main stage TED.
Big stage TED with all the really important people. Talk about that, and then maybe speak on Facebook, because a lot of people do associate the metaverse with an Oculus headset.
Yes.
And also maybe speak about how you always knew that model would fail because it is closed. That's really interesting to me. And again, the first time we spoke 2 years ago, you're an optimistic guy. Okay, sure. You're a forward-thinking guy. But the only time I've ever seen you get a little prickly is when you say, "Don't close my metaverse," and
right.
We have to make sure this company doesn't close my metaverse.
Yes.
That's the one time I've seen you get angry.
No, but yes,
angry,
yes,
but
exactly.
concerned. And so you made that point, and I remember that back in 21, you said, we cannot allow our metaverse to be closed.
Yes.
So maybe speak on those things.
Well, first, the TED experience was amazing, an incredible honor, of course. The pressure to speak, I think I said, certainly the speakers I had sort of, anecdotal conversations. The pressure to speak on a stage like TED is enormous, because it's not only that you amongst peers or other people who have incredible influence that you could influence. It's also the fact that its reach reaches out to millions and millions of people who are seekers of truth and knowledge, if you think about it. And so having a perspective that they didn't understand about the metaverse is so important. So the pressure isn't just, how am I sort of displaying myself amongst my peers? The pressure is, can I deliver a message to a wide audience that probably doesn't know anything about what Web3 and the metaverse, the open metaverse, really is, in a manner that lets them at least open their eyes and say, oh, I hadn't thought about it this way. Now, I got a lot of feedback at TED that they thought, they understood now after the talk. But will this work for the wider audience? We shall see, right? Because it hasn't been published yet. But that's where the pressure comes from. And, incredibly world-class speakers and public speakers have come there, and you see them nervous. And that doesn't help, because then you get nervous as well, because they're like, oh my God, if this guy is nervous, then what am I, right? You absolutely have imposter syndrome when you're going up on a stage like TED.
And but you have like 18 minutes or something, right?
12 minutes.
12.
Most talks were like 10, 12 minutes.
I love 10, yeah.
So but that means you have to condense an incredible amount of time in a short period of time. So you have to rehearse much more strictly. And I was sort of giving this comment to a few people. It's like, I may as well have been reciting Shakespeare, right? Being up there, because you have to have it so together, and you can't really miss a beat, because if you do, then everything goes to crap almost, right? And so it was definitely a nerve-wracking experience. But the other thing I would say, and I think it worked reasonably well, I hope. But I also, the experience taught me that after the event, the kind of people who came to me and sort of, we formed a little sort of Web3 NFT club, where it's like, oh, yay, wonderful, finally we have a talk about Web3 in TED. I can count them by, two hands as to how many people said they had NFTs. That was astounding to me, because you think of TED, it's technology, entertainment and design, right? So you would imagine that many more people would have NFTs and would understand the open metaverse, or at least have an inkling of it. And most commentaries I got was, oh, I never understood this. This was really interesting, new perspective. And this is 2023, which just tells me how much we are in our own bubble, right? And how much more work we need to do to reach out to other people, to really explain to them what this opportunity is all about and why it's so important. Data sovereignty, owning our data, owning the derivative of our data is so critical, and people don't understand that, especially in this age of AI, because after all, AI lives off our data. We are feeding the AI. You wouldn't have ChatGPT or self-driving cars if it wasn't for our data. And how much are we getting paid for it? Big fat zero, right? We get entertained for it. We can use it in some derivative ways for value, but where does the value accrue? In the data models, in the companies who own that data. So that's why Web3 is absolutely critical. Really, I think, even for sort of our political and our human future, I think it is very important that we have data as a construct where we have property rights, and therefore becomes essentially owning our data is like a human right.
Yeah, and you talked about digital colonialism on our first episode, and I didn't understand this concept of you giving away your data and someone selling it back to you.
Yes.
Basically, maybe like colonialism was done, maybe back even in the British Empire back in the day.
Well, I mean, think about, the cotton trade in right here in the UK, what they did, right? They would basically buy, cheap cotton from India, right? Bring it back, mill it, and sell it back for expensive clothing at high prices to India. It was impossible as a nation to ever come out of this, and constantly extract value from until obviously there was a revolt.
Right.
But economically, it was a kind of economic enslavement, and that's essentially what's happening with data right now, because the value that they generate from the data, as you said, right, is actually ours, but they sell it back to us in a refined format that we're paying for. I mean, the most ridiculous thing I find is that, and Facebook didn't do this in the beginning, you have a Facebook group. You want to retarget your customers on your Facebook group? Here's a budget you can spend on that. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Right? These are supposed to be my customers. Oh, no. They're not really your customers, right? And by the way, we can remove that Facebook group. You can lose your access to it. They're never actually your customers.
Yeah, that became very obvious to me. And then that whole point of digital ownership and identity. And yeah, I mean, in 2020, we almost lost our 2 million YouTube subscribers and about 10,000 videos in about 10 years of my life.
Yes.
And again, and because of some of the things I was posting, I wasn't allowed communication to those subscribers. So I had to pay for them to see what I was doing. And then I almost lost that whole digital identity. And everyone said, well, you signed the community agreement. And I was like, but that's my identity that's being taken away from me. Something's not right here. It just felt like a human right was being violated.
Absolutely. And there's no due process at all because it's a terms of service. And that's because the legal construct right now in data is kind of like air, right? So which means that the terms of service is apparently sufficient. It's contract law, right?
Right.
And that's really a big problem, because as you put earlier, that type of stuff, when you lose much more than just some economic value. You lose everything about you, and you're completely beholden to a platform that wasn't elected, that doesn't actually have governmental power. It actually just has corporate powers. Now think of the inverse as well. Facebook can topple governments, right? They have the ability to basically remove news organizations, which is what they did in Australia. Not too long ago, for instance, when there was an issue around paying, for instance, the relative fees that maybe Australian news agencies wanted them to pay. They said, oh, well, if that's what you want, then we're just going to sort of cut off your access to the customers, because they're our customers, right? I mean, that is not possible to sort of restrict freedom of speech in this manner because of the fact that there's no parallel for it. But actually, that's what they're able to do, and it's very, very dangerous, because they're not driven by something that is driven by the community. They're driven simply for profit, and they're driven by the interest of a minority as opposed to a larger majority which you're supposed to serve. And that's why Web3 and blockchain is so interesting, because DAOs, for instance, which I think are the future organizations of the world, represent that. Because now, if I'm a customer, I'm no longer just a customer, I'm an owner, which means that I end up basically being a participant in the network. I don't have the same ownership as perhaps you or someone else, but I still have a voice. And we can come together and make decisions. Like, to me, the Facebook of the future is not going to be a shareholder corporation. It's going to be kind of a stakeholder system where there are shareholders perhaps, but every user of Facebook would also be an owner, right? And that's what you see with Sandbox, for instance. If you own a piece of land in Sandbox, you're not a consumer, you're an owner. You have a stake. If you own a Bored Ape, you're an owner. You have an ability to communicate to the network, you have a vote, you have a say in how it runs. And if you don't like it, sure, you can sell it or you can do whatever, but you have a voice. In Facebook, you don't have a voice as a user. You talk to possibly an AI, right? That basically says, these are the 5 things you can do, and you send your complaint in, and it goes to a black hole under advisement, and good luck, right? The only way to get stuff done, like in terms of all the fraud, is maybe someone senior at Facebook, and then maybe they can help you out faster than the normal processes because you're just another cog. I mean, just think about how impersonal our human relationships are with these platforms.
Yeah, and then you take it a step further and you look at Twitter files or what happened to suppression of news stories around the election, and it's like, wow, now these companies are actually violating amendments of the Constitution,
yes,
based with pressure on the government. So you get all the bad parts of human organizations that way. And it kind of goes full circle. I mean,
if you can silence a president,
yeah.
I mean, regardless of the nature of his content, you go, wait, hold on a second. How does that work, right? How does that work? And that kind of gives you probably a very good indication as to where we are right now in the world of Web 2.
It's a perfect example that it's broken.
Yes.
And I think it's worth talking about to magnify and say it's broken on so many levels. It was an important and possibly necessary transition from Web 1 to Web 3. Maybe there was no other way to do it. It brought so many people so much value, created culture, all sorts of digital interaction. Yes. But we see so many examples now, from censorship to the property rights to the business models to the direction of the ownership, that it's probably high time everybody, including the people at TED that maybe don't know this that well, to look at and say, that's broken, that's broken, that's broken, that's broken. And this Web3 can solve all of those things.
That's right. I would say that the acknowledgement that is broken is universal, right? Meaning that I think most people will agree that the current digital framework doesn't work. Governments may deal with it slightly differently around privacy laws, for instance. Organizations might be looking at how do I protect my data in terms of service, contractual matters. But Web3 to me is a way that can solve that broadly. One of the fascinating things about technology, broadly speaking, is that when technology, usually through human hands, creates a problem, technology also creates a solution, right? It's never a one-way road to darkness, right? There is always sort of, because technology innovates and it grows. And I also believe generally in the sort of optimistic and sort of the good-spirited and positive nature of humanity, broadly speaking, that if there is a problem, we come together. If there's a crisis, we come together and we say, that doesn't work. We need a solution. I mean, think about the birth of Bitcoin. There was a problem in the financial system. It was something that people recognized in that generation that there would be a problem. And so it was a revolt to that. It was a technology revolt, a solution on something that was broken in the financial system that they disagreed with. It was effectively a subversive move, you could say, but it was one where people came together and said, we think this is better. And this happens all the time in technology. So anyway, I don't believe that, yes, it's gone bad, but that's not sort of, we can't stop that it's gone bad in the same way, but we can use technology, as we now see with Web3 and blockchain, as a way to basically self-correct around that. And the self-correction basically is data ownership. If we own the data, if we own the derivatives of those rights of those data, then the third parties that abuse it can actually really abuse it in this manner because we have transparency as to what they do. Right? I think I gave this example. If Facebook actually declared how much value it generates from you, then there'll be intermediaries that come in and say, well, Brian, your channel on Facebook or on YouTube, for instance, is making us millions of dollars. Well, some other platform will come to you and say, I'll pay you a better rate, right? You have those kind of sort of commercial transactions that are possible, as we have seen what Web 1 did with general broader trade. And that basically, that trade of that data commodity has always been locked until today. And I think this is the fact that people don't see, because they don't see data as a commodity. They don't understand. It's like bits and sort of bytes flowing around in sort of this ethereal manner that they can interpret. But I would say the same is about oil. I mean, you see oil on the street, you can't interpret that, right? I mean, you understand intellectually what it can produce now from energy and plastics and whatever else, but you don't actually understand how it works. You don't need to. You just need to know that if I have oil in my backyard, that has value. And we need to think exactly the same way about our data.
Let's talk about property rights then, because funny enough, there was this guy from Hong Kong who runs a big Metaverse company that taught me about property rights. That was you. And how they're inextricably linked into democracy and capitalism, and then also having a stake in our future. And it's something that's easy to forget, especially in the digital world where we don't really understand that we have those property rights. But I was curious if you could talk about what we've seen now in America, where you almost have this anti-capitalistic narrative, which is kind of fascinating to see. And it really perturbs the elder people because
it's shocking, actually. It's shocking.
It is shocking. It's hard to understand, and I think you have a theory on what's happening there, and also quite a different narrative in Asia, and also kind of regulations that maybe mirror
absolutely.
Those
and
things.
I think this is very different when you look at Asia or Middle East versus what's happening in the US. So I mean, in the context of the US, I think let's just sort of bring up sort of founding fathers, right? I mean, George Washington specifically said that property rights and freedom, basically are absolutely interlinked, right? You can't have one without the other. And this is also true for the digital realm. It's the same thing. Property rights are a foundation for this. But why is it a foundation for this? Well, it's a foundation for this because of the fact that when you have the freedom to really own something, then you have the freedom to transact. You have the freedom to do whatever you want with it. And only one level of transaction means I can trade with it. That's one level of abstraction. But the other areas is that when I own something, nobody else can come in and take it away from me, which also means an intermediary, a third party, can come and say, oh, you happen to own this item, maybe this house or this car. I have something I can do to your car because it's no longer owned by the company that created it. It's owned by you. Let me give you a paint job for your car. You don't like that red color? I'll make it silver. I'll make it blue. And you just created a relationship and a job. And again, that service element, by the way, that network effect that was created from that person who gave you value to the car might give value to other cars in the same manner. What happens to the object, the car that you own? It's more valuable to you. And the utility of the car expanded from, beyond a transportation device to something that makes you feel good, or to something that expresses you, for instance, right? There are thousands of companies that are now in existence because we own cars. There are thousands of companies in existence because we can own our phones. Like you can buy headphones and you can get phone cases. There are myriads of companies that provide services because you own a house. For instance, from furniture, from art, from banking services, right? If we didn't have property rights, you can't do any of that stuff. There's also no capital formation with property rights because I can't invest. If I don't own something, then I can't really put value into it for the long term. If I know I own this, I can invest with a 20-year, 30-year business plan. If I own my real estate, I can build a restaurant, I can build a business, knowing that this is mine and I can invest in it. Just think about when you own a house, how you think about renovating your own house versus a rental home. I mean, that's a feeling, but it's fact, right? You are never going to invest as much money into that. And that's the paradigm. So you have basically capital formation. The countries, this is already very well studied. All the countries that have very strong property rights, physical property rights, have very high GDPs. The US, or Hong Kong, Singapore, the UK, right? And the countries that have no property rights, North Korea, or low property rights, many sort of, African or sort of certain South American countries as well.
Where they don't even know if their property will be there next year because somebody might take it.
Because the government either takes it or the government is overthrown.
Right.
I think another thing that a lot of people don't understand is how property rights works, particularly the youth. Because they think of, I live in this house, it's physical, therefore it's real. But the ownership of this house is not made real because of the bricks it's built on. It's made real because of a virtual contract that is the Constitution in America, or it's contract law in other places around the world. It's the government that enables it. Because if that government disappears, that house you think you own, you don't own either. So our actual physical rights and ownership are virtual constructs upheld by people who we elected, which is a democratic system as well. If you have a monarch, or you have a despot, or you have basically someone who has sort of dictatorial powers, they get to decide whether you can own it or not. And it's not something that you can change. And so while it may appear that he's a benevolent dictator, so it may work for a little while, but he might die, right? As they don't live forever. A new person comes in with that kind of central power. We do not know whether this person will change. So how do you ensure that safety? This is where things like a democratic framework, where things like a constitution start to come in, because you have a framework that you respect. And I think the war, if you want to call it, that sort of ideological war that's happening in the US, is very much a war on how people interpret the Constitution. And it comes, unfortunately, on the back of, I think, politics in terms of how you get elected. Not necessarily what's right for the country in many cases. The irony is that the rest of the world still aspires to American ideas, right? They may not necessarily agree what's happening in America, but the American idea of property rights and liberty and freedom is actually what other countries want. Asia, for instance, is actually a place where capitalism is thriving. There is inequity, but because in living memory, people are actually better off than they were before because of a capitalist framework, because of the introduction of property rights. Most people don't remember or even know that South Korea in the early 80s had a lower GDP than North Korea. They introduced property rights, capitalism, democracy, and today, 12th or 13th largest country by GDP. Right? I mean, this is an example. We're talking about 80s. We were born in the 80s or 70s, right? We remember those times, and our families experienced that. That's why they believe in this. But when you look at sort of American youth, and they look at that and they say, well, first of all, capitalism hasn't worked for them.
Right.
And, zero interest and all that kind of stuff, inflation have all sort of played a hand in this. But the other thing, of course, is that they don't exactly study how property rights works. They don't understand the benefits of capitalism in the same way, and they also take it for granted.
Yeah.
Right? Because they've always had it. I mean, the sort of the concern that you would lose your property or that you know what it's like not to have it is not a couple generations away. It's hundreds of years away, right? Nobody in America would fear that if I bought this house, I might not have it. Right?
Yeah.
And you see this expression in immigrant societies. So for instance, one of the most predominant immigrant societies, if not the most sort of predominant one, is Chinese, specifically Chinese diaspora, right? Because of the wars, because of the Civil War, because of everything, they spread all over the world. And whether it's a Chinatown here, it's a community there are more overseas Chinese than there are people in France. Right? I mean, that just gives you an idea of the strength of the diaspora. And of course, you have other diaspora like Japanese and whatever, right? And one of the things that they always obsess about is property, buying real estate. Why? Because they can't have it back home when they left the country. It's so embedded in the culture because of the uncertainty in which they were sort of removed from. Whereas if you are an incumbent, you were living in this country, you're just fine. It's always there. I don't care, right? And I remember I grew up in Austria, so in the Germanic-speaking region, and I remember actually more so in Germany than in Austria, because they were so comfortable with the rights of ownership. Most people just were renting. So Berlin, for instance, still has, I don't know what it is now, but back literally just 10 years ago, I think home ownership was under 20%. Because everyone's like, well, why should I own a property? What's the point? Let me just rent, right? But of course, what happens, and this is the problem about sort of what happens in a capital society, which still Germany ultimately still capitalist, right? Is that owning stuff appreciates in value, and has basically sort of growth potential because of framework of equity and capital versus labor, which has stayed largely flat. In fact, if you sort of put real labor wage values from a decade or two ago, it's actually come down, right? Because of the zero cost of capital, because of inflation. So that means that as a labor worker, you are now making less money than in real terms than you were making a decade ago. You can no longer afford that house. You can no longer even rent that house that perhaps your parents could have. Now that is jarring, right? And that's where capitalism broke. But it broke because of financial, sort of, I would say, somewhat irresponsible fiscal policy and all the things that many of the Web3 and crypto world railed against. It's sort of the genesis of this, because they foresaw these particular problems. And now they're trying to do sort of a very painful sort of rollback. And how do you do that? So I think the solution, which is what Web3 can offer, is that if we make everyone an owner somehow, even if it doesn't have to be in the same proportions for their contributions, then we all have a stake in it. I think of this as a mental model. Imagine, all these young Americans that don't own property, if they could even have had fractional ownership in the properties that they had. They don't have to own the house they live in, but they could have some value of the depreciation capital instead of just thinking of their salary, which basically is just declining as an asset class. Then maybe there are certain economic circumstances I would certainly be better. Maybe they would be happier about the circumstances because they get to participate in the growth of that. But there is no framework for that, right? You don't pay people in equity, and you can't feed people in equity in a traditional sense. This is what pension funds and 401ks and these type of things were supposed to solve. But what do they hold? They hold cash, right? They hold these type of other assets that don't appreciate. But what if they owned things that you could own, for instance, like houses or real estate as an example? Actually, that value becomes much more interesting because then you get to participate in appreciation. I also think that in the Web2 economy, we told a lot of lies, which is very sad. If you remember the whole sort of service gig economy, which was the whole Uber and Airbnb, we told our youth, you don't want to own anything. You don't need to own anything, right? You can just, use an Uber and you go to Airbnb. We're nomads, or they're nomads. They don't have to own anything. Those lies, they're paying for right now. Right? And while it may have been an interesting theory and a good idea, actually, maybe as a concept, that we maybe not have to own anything. In a society where we have capitalism at play, that doesn't work. In a world of capitalism, we need to basically give people a stake in this capitalist environment. And the stake is not cash. The stake is owning something. And in Web3, we can hopefully redraw that. And I think, unfortunately, in the physical context, the youth have been excluded. So now, unfortunately, many young Americans, I think there was some recent poll studies that showed that 60% sort of are actually more socialist-minded than capitalist-minded, because they look at someone that's made a lot of money and they no longer look at it from the perspective of, the American dream. Hey, good on you. I think I can do that as well. I'm going to work hard to get there. They think of it from the perspective of that's unfair, right? And unfortunately, because of the inheritable nature of money and value and property particularly, because that appreciates, there's a sense of injustice as well. You inherited that. You didn't earn it. So why should you have it, right? And as this progresses, you have more money. It means you have access to better education. It means you get better access to services and all that stuff, which is why, hot topics like affirmative action and everything sort of come up in very, very complicated terms, because somehow people and governments are trying to sort of right these inequities, which they acknowledge, but they don't have a good solution because they haven't found a way to bring broad population collectively into a new economic framework. For us, that's why Web3 provides so much opportunities, because tokenization is stakeholder capitalism. Everyone has a stake and has a way in which they can participate, which isn't possible right now in physical terms.
Do you think this is also why we see very different regulatory environments? I mean, Hong Kong
Absolutely.
is embracing crypto. Exchanges are welcoming retail in. And in America, it's the opposite. You got people cracking down. Maybe NFTs are next,
So I would say that for me, so you never write off America, because America is still the only place in the world that has sort of creative destruction and innovation at a level that's, let's look at, for instance, what happened with AI, for instance. I mean, for the longest time, the narrative was America's losing the AI war to China. That narrative is dead. Everyone's like, oh, why? Because America still has the penchant and ability to create this kind of discourse that is almost not just disruptive, but potentially sort of explosive, that many other countries in the world simply won't permit to happen, right? So this is really, I think, an American superpower. Right, so when they start coming back into Web3 or blockchain in sort of a national sense, I think the industry is just going to sort of grow really, really fast, because there's a lot of believers in America. They just can't really talk about it the same way that perhaps people in Asia can. But there's another thing as well, which is that in Hong Kong, for instance, they're very progressive with their laws. We just had a big Web3 festival. Many companies are setting up there. I mean, what is the other thing about Hong Kong? Hong Kong is typically either number 1 or number 2 freest economy in the world, right? It's constantly rated as one of the top freest markets in the world. And what is Web3 and blockchain? It's all about free market liberalism in that sense, having sort of the freedom to transact and having the freedom of our ownership of these things. I would say that's a value that is very American, but the narrative politically has changed. You wouldn't have a candidate like Bernie Sanders possible, say, even 10 years ago. Right? That just tells you about the state of America, for instance. Mm-hmm. And if you think about the party politics right now, the anti-capitalist narrative seems to veer more and more into one party side, whereas the pro-capitalist narrative is something that seems to be much more on one side, and it's becoming a war of that. I mean, again, not to debate what's right or wrong, but canceling student debt, for instance, is a very, very hot topic, because on one, it's like, why should they do that? I paid my student debt. Versus the other one is like, it's just unfair, right? And you ought to do that because the system is not fair, and we deserve it, or whatever the narrative is, which is incompatible with an ideological belief as to what your rights are, and that's basically the dividing line. But I do have hope for the U.S. because of its democratic and constitutional framework, there is always a kind of self-correction that seems to happen, and that's possible, because at the end of the day, in this land of America, as you have in other nations, of course, you want what's best for the country. So the only thing is now, how are we able to communicate and explain that? And there's enough forces that I think want to see the right thing happen. But it's a progressing story over time, right? And at least you can have these open public debates, which in other countries you simply can't, right? It's like, I would argue even in certain European countries, even though you have freedom of speech, there is a social culture that prevents you from expressing these concerns because of their traditions and history.
Right. That's not a problem in America.
Yeah, that's certainly not a problem in America. Yes.
Yeah, and right. Betting against America is never a good idea because it's got a history of creation, destruction. I mean, look at the way it bounced back from the financial crisis was always impressive to me. People fired from jobs they've had for 20 years, and like a few years later, it's like, it was painful, but they retrained themselves and they moved workforces and people moved locations, and it was like, okay, this is how you bounce back. And I agree. But to watch the regulation right now, it's just hard to watch. I mean, I don't think there's been a technology, you could argue, in the last 50 years that America hasn't dominated. But now in blockchain, most of the activity is outside of America. Brian Armstrong is visiting the UAE very publicly this last week, shaking hands with all the people, saying how wonderful it is over there. Dubai's not far from Hong Kong when it comes to being very open.
I would say Dubai, at least this moment in time, is actually ahead of Hong Kong in terms of regulatory framework. But certainly Hong Kong has the ambition to overtake Dubai and other places. You know, the narrative last year for Hong Kong was to be the regional leader. I think Hong Kong has a shot at being a global leader, because when you think about it in terms of stock markets and liquidity as a market in the traditional world, Hong Kong Stock Exchange is top 5 in the world, right? I mean,
that foreign exchange was always a hub.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a major trade and finance center. And Hong Kong also recognizes that. How do you sort of regain the fintech crown and be a player in the space? It's to do stuff in Web3. But here's other thing that's really interesting, which is that in Asia and in the Middle East, and to some extent Europe, part of the reason why people are driving so hard into Web3 is because there's a degree of being fed up and being sort of colonized by American technologies. Right? I mean, think about it. Everywhere else in the world, they depend on, whether it's LinkedIn or Facebook or Amazon or Google, right? Except for places that close their markets like China. Actually, all over the world, they're dependent on American technologies. So they are, in effect, as a nation, colonized. Now think about what that means for things like national security, and think about what that means for sort of dissemination of your local culture and your local identity. They don't want that. So the countries have basically said, this is an opportunity in which you can grab that sort of narrative back. And for some whatever reason, America has willingly surrendered its lead that it had for the time being. That, the Japanese Prime Minister has made Web3 in the Metaverse one of his national agenda items, as has Hong Kong, for instance, and, parts of the Middle East. And even Europe, with the recent sort of proposals on the micro rules, actually looks like Europe is going to have more progressive sort of blockchain, crypto, and Web3 related laws than America. I mean, when has this happened, right? This is the astounding thing. And of course, unfortunately, I think a lot of people would conclude that it is more political in nature than it has anything to do with the underlying. Because it's very, very rare that the rest of the world seems to be going in one direction and America's going the other one. That is extremely rare to see. So again, it's other forces at work, shall we say.
Yeah, it's very political. I mean, if you look at some of the hearings recently, whether it's the FTX one or there was another one recently, stablecoins, I'm not sure it was, but I mean, I watch them and they're almost like comedy because each party just comes in and just takes their digs, usually at the other party, as the person in front of them is the whipping boy, whether it's Twitter or this or that, and all you see is a big division and you see no innovation or advancement. And that's really what's happening right now. And again, like you said, when
it's driving innovation outside.
Yeah,
right? It's driving innovation outside. It's not to say that they don't want to innovate. It's that they have to go elsewhere to continue doing that. I think this, however, is not a bad thing necessarily, because it forces people to become competitive. Hong Kong was very complacent a couple of years ago, pre-COVID and pre-protests. So when Singapore, for instance, was starting to lead in the space, they're like, it's Singapore, they'll do what they do, but people will just automatically come to Hong Kong, which was true for a moment in time. But then all these things happened, and all these setbacks happened, and now Hong Kong woke up and we need to be competitive. They even have a Web3 marketing fund in Hong Kong, right? I mean, that to me is astounding. It shows that Hong Kong is no longer thinking that we can just have people come to us because we're Hong Kong. We have to stay competitive. We have to do stuff. We have to motivate and create incentives to stay ahead of the curve. And that to me is, I think, hopefully where America will land as well. Because of course, if Hong Kong is becoming a leader in Web3, this isn't about Hong Kong. This is about the other superpower as well, which is China, to say, hey, we have a way in which we can play in this field and have a narrative through Hong Kong, right? I mean, this is the politics at play. And if there is perhaps one nation in the world that the US is paying attention very carefully, it will probably be that one.
Can you explain this relationship between Hong Kong and China? Or do you need 100 years and 1,000 pages to explain?
No, it's a very simple relationship. I mean, there's more complexity, but generally speaking, Hong Kong has always been the financial center and basically the gateway in and out of China. But when you think about whether you invest in China or whether Chinese nationals want to invest into the world, Hong Kong has been that hub, right? And a lot of people used to say, oh, Shanghai or Guangzhou or other regions in China will eventually displace Hong Kong. It's not going to work. Absolutely not true. If anything, in a certain global environment, Hong Kong has solidified itself even more in its role. Someone's not going to go to China and to Shanghai and conduct the same kind of business as they could do in Hong Kong. It's not just the rule of law and the infrastructure in place, it's the culture.
The history, the human capital, everything in place.
The human capital, the fact that Hong Kong has been this cultural bridge between East and West isn't something that you can just replicate overnight. Right. It's generations and generations of it, right? Even though as a city, Shanghai is super modern and very progressive and a wonderful place, the culture of Shanghai is not the culture of Hong Kong. Right. And if you want to trade with the world, when the lingua franca of the world is still English, Hong Kong is the place. You have great English in China, by the way, right? I mean, I think there's more people studying English in China than there's Americans in America, for instance. Okay. So as a quantum, there's enough people learning English, but that doesn't mean that you bring with it all of the culture in which you can conduct business or create relationships and have the freedom to travel and conduct business in that manner. So Hong Kong is the most important trading port, I would say, for China into the world and outside. Now, there's certain policies like Belt and Road and so on that you could say that China is also creating on the side. That's obviously critical to them to create other frameworks for this. But I don't think they're going to have the same impact, at least in the near to midterm, as what Hong Kong has right now. And that to me also means, and this is obviously speculation at this point, is that when you think about Web3 and broadly digital assets, if you're a person from China, instead of putting your money in Singapore, which is what you used to do, you can now do it through Hong Kong, for instance. And that actually is better for the Greater China region, but it's also a way in which Hong Kong basically becomes more relevant in this. And I think much of the innovation and development in the Web3 and broadly digital asset space will come from the region for that reason.
And people forget a lot of crypto startups were in Hong Kong. Right. Crypto.com, FTX back in the day, yes. Just saying. But there was a lot of, that was the place to go for innovation. And again, a former big financial hub. I mean, when I started on Wall Street, Hong Kong was big. Singapore was obviously pulling market share there for various reasons. But yeah, it's got that history. Imagine if Brian Armstrong just moved Coinbase there. Do you think that would get the attention maybe of U.S. regulators a little bit?
Yes, yeah. It's a matter of, I wonder if it's a matter of how much do you want to poke the bear. But certainly, I think it would send an incredible message if they actually were even considering it. I think Brian Armstrong doesn't even necessarily have to say anything. He just has to visit Hong Kong.
Yeah.
He just has to come in and take a look. That's all he has to do.
I know. Wear the suit, shake a few hands.
That's right.
Post it on Twitter. That's all you need to do, right? Old school. I wish you would, because it might just get everybody together when it comes to regulation in the States. Yeah. It's still a big question mark. What's the focus for Animoca now? I know you're doing some big moves in education.
Yes.
You do a lot of moves. And maybe, honestly, Yat, it took me probably a year to get my head even around what Animoca is. Are you a gaming company? Are you a hedge fund? Are you a venture fund? You do so many things. So what is on your mind these days? Where are you headed and what's important?
Well, the mission, digital property rights, and building up essentially Web3 toward is where we hope it will be in the future, is still the broad mission. And I think the lens that we can take of it is a little bit like, what was the original promise of the internet, as in Web 1, as we call it today? And that was around decentralization of information and broad, basically, sort of freedoms online that you could express in a manner that you couldn't maybe have perhaps do physically. And that was a form of broader democratic and open frameworks. The framework that continued to thrive despite everything was open source, but everything else pretty much became walled gardens in Web 2. In Web 3, we have this potential to do exactly what Web 1 was really supposed to do. Except now in this framework, we have ownership of our data, which is actually the raw material of the open metaverse. It's actually what's valuable. And by decentralizing the power structures of data, we essentially create a sort of property rights, sort of freedom, a type of framework for this new internet. So that's kind of what we're trying to build. But how do we do that? Well, one of the things about how to build that is that we believe in this thing called the shared network effect, which is possible in blockchain. The example of this would be, you may not necessarily invest in, Ethereum. In a company that's building on stuff in Ethereum. But just simply owning Ethereum tokens is effectively a way in which you get to participate in the long-term effects of what Ethereum is building over time, right? Maybe it's going to grow, and if it will grow, then you already are a stakeholder just by owning, a number of tokens without necessarily having to sort of invest in 5 or 6 other companies. You might get better returns, but you also take more risk. But you're taking a bet on the entire ecosystem, just simply hold the token and do stuff with that, right? So that's a form of stakeholder capitalism. That's a form of participation that we're now able to do where everyone can do that. So that's the broad picture that we're hoping for. How do we build that? We invest in hundreds of companies that can basically grow that space. And even if the companies themselves don't necessarily all succeed, they will have contributed a part in helping grow an ecosystem that has long-term benefits. And we think of this like the construction in the open metaverse. We all give parallels to a country, right? So when you invest in a country, you build infrastructure, you have to build restaurants, you have to build businesses and all that kind of stuff. You have to provide them with some kind of funding to do that. That's basically a part of our role. But also, we look at it from what went wrong with Web 1. And Web 1, a lot of the investors at the time were investing on the basis of simply capital returns, which makes sense because they're a fund. But almost all of our investment comes from our balance sheet, which means that we're able to take a very, very long view. We can say, hey, 30 years down the road, let's see where this goes. And we can invest with purpose in terms of how we think about where the world will go. Because if we're right about this, which we certainly hope we are, then we will do well anyway. Because the adoption curve, right, which if you look at some of these charts, they show how Web 1 and Web 3 adoption in relative years are almost 1-to-1, right? So in terms of the growth curves, we're kind of in the 2001, 2002 age of Web 1, and the wallet adoption versus the internet connections, which is sort of that parallel, it's uncanny how it tracks, right? Which is
like
fascinating.
4% penetration.
Yeah, exactly. It's
right.
Just small.
Which is like 01 or maybe even earlier.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But that just shows exactly what the potential could be, and so therefore, as long as we're broadly invested, we can help participate in the space. But also, it allows us to then take a broader view. If we only invested in 1 or 2 companies and built our own products, we have a natural tendency to want to protect those institutions that we're supporting. But if we're invested in over 400 companies and continue to invest in the broader ecosystem, then we can take a much broader view. We can say what's better for everything while still maintaining capital returns and capitalist sort of incentives within the structure. Because we're not a foundation. We're still a for-profit entity. We have to provide returns. But how do we inoculate ourselves against monopolistic behavior? By being so broadly invested in the ecosystem as a whole, which basically provides us a framework where we can now sort of have, it's not altruistic in the classic sense, but we can take a much more sort of long-term holistic view that's healthy for the ecosystem. Imagine if Apple or Facebook actually had a stake in, a large swath of, we're talking in this case, thousands of companies, had a stake in those companies that were building stuff on Facebook or building stuff on the App Store. What would their behavior look like? Very, very different, I think, right? It's not only because they might have a say in stuff, it's also that their financial incentives aren't entirely driven only by how much I make as an app store. I'm also thinking, well, if I take too much from those companies, the value of the equity or the value of the companies will reduce. As therefore, I create a balance. What's healthier? And I think what's healthier is that we all have stakes in each other, so we have shared mutual success, rather than one person trying to monopolize the other. And that's what Web3 is able to do because it has a classic, sort of very inherent anti-monopolistic framework. Now,
and when it's on your balance sheet, you're not in a fund. I know you're raising $1 billion fund right now, but with a fund, you're saying it has a fixed maturity and people are expecting returns at the end of the day.
And so you're required to liquidate and do that kind of stuff.
When it's on your balance sheet, you can have a much longer term perspective.
Well, also, having it on the balance sheet has other effects. For instance, when we hold tokens in a balance sheet, we have governance. To us, that's what's important. We want to be able to have a say in where things are guided, for instance. Right? So for instance, if you own the Mochaverse NFT, that actually gives you a voice in some of our token holdings to decide how it gets invested. We want to decentralize the governance piece to our communities, not only so they can learn about democracy and get involved, but also because they can now have a say in how these communities should build. Because if the same stakeholders have a say in how it's being built, it forces, let's call it the large organizations, to listen to them, to say, oh, well, okay, let me take, it's no longer just under advisement. It has a real effect if someone with actual voting power can actually impact your decisions. So you have to start to listen. You have to start to behave in a good actor kind of way. You have to do the right thing. Otherwise, you won't get what you want. Right? So that's kind of part of that mechanism. But of course, the other thing is that there's a parallel between creating capital assets out of things that have value already that didn't exist before because you weren't able to do that. And that is what happened with education. And that's something we're really, really excited about, because the creator economy that's even larger than artists and musicians is actually teachers and people who are making educational content. If you look at, for instance, YouTube or TikTok, right? These are huge platforms, but what are they doing on these platforms? They're actually learning. They're actually going online and sort of studying things that they didn't have access to before. So it's arguably the biggest learning channels are these platforms. So what TinyTap and what Open Campus basically have enabled is a way in which a teacher who's making some money on educational content they've created, that in itself then becomes an asset because it creates an income from the platform, maybe $100, $1,000, or in some cases just $10 or $20 a year. And that's the kind of value they would receive as a teacher. So it's side income, it's nice, right? But now, if you sell it as an NFT, with a single transaction, you own the IP, you transfer the rights, you even transfer where the money might go in terms of the value. So everything in a single transaction of an NFT, all the contract work sort of compressed, and then you have capital formation, because if I'm happy to get 10% yield on this $100 item, I might pay you $1,000. That has a big impact, right? Now, think about all the things that we do in not just culture, but in content or whatever, that might only make us $5 or $10 or $20. Or think about the developing countries, where you can make content that might only pay you $1 or $2 or $3, maybe even a year, for instance, for the value you create. That becomes a capital asset, because in the physical world, in order to do a transaction, you have to hire a lawyer, right? You have to get a contract. You have to put that all together. That'll cost you thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars, which means you can't actually transact something that is worth that much, right? It's the same thing when you have bank accounts. Unless, if a wire transfer costs $20, you can't bank someone that makes $5 a month, for instance, right? So again, in that same way, how crypto or sort of blockchain solves that for sort of people who are unbanked, it can now solve it for these capital assets. So I'm making even just $5 a year, but now I would sell that $5 a year to someone for maybe $20, $30, $40 because of that yield it would generate. The life-changing impact in those places that it would have to basically receive forward value, as we have seen in the countries that have property rights, is transformational, right? And it is locked value. It exists there. It's just as was described by sort of economists, it's dead capital. And with basically NFTs, you unlock that value and you open up these economies. And you open up these economies without the risk, this is the other powerful thing, without the risk of interference from governments. Because you could be in an unstable government where you couldn't have ownership, but the NFT does not depend on the government. It could be a buyer from America, and he could still get yield from this asset because of the fact that you created this content for a customer somewhere around the world. Right? And that we've done now as a launch with Open Campus, which is known as the EDU token. Had a launch not too long ago at Binance, which was its largest its largest IO in terms of volume in I think in something like 3 years or something. So that was an astounding launch, which to me indicates again the excitement around the potential and the meaning of education. Like a lot of people don't understand necessarily. They look at gaming. Gaming is very important in terms of engagement and so on. And last year it was a $200 billion industry, so it's absolutely a critical industry. But education is a $5 trillion industry today. I mean, just think how much money parents and so on spend on their education, and also national spending. But teachers are chronically underpaid. And how do we improve our education system and just generally make the world better when we can't pay our teachers a right salary? And this is where Web3 and blockchain can actually solve a real big problem, I think, that people can empathize with as well. They can say, oh, okay, art and gaming, particularly art is a little esoteric. They don't quite understand it because maybe they don't collect art or they don't have art. And also it feels a little elitist, right? It's like, oh, this painting, yeah, that's nice, but I don't want that, right? And gaming, while gaming is absolutely important and a source of culture, and I would say very educational, for people who don't play games, it feels almost dangerous, right? It's like my kids are stuck on the screen, I don't understand it. But education and teachers is different. It hits home because it's so important to our society. And I think that's why I'm also excited, not just because of what it can do for the benefits of health teachers, but also what it can do for our industry, that we can talk about really the impact that Web3 and blockchain can do in a measurable way. The first teachers that generated value by selling the NFTs, some of them made over a year's worth of their salary. And they were just amazed. But also, we have to recognize that most teachers in the world are not financially educated. So when you onboard any person from Web 2 to Web 3, you're not just opening a wallet for them. The effective onboarding comes with financial education. That's the part that has been missing. We democratized information, but we didn't democratize value and understanding of value, and that's the big possibility of Web3 as well. And I think the world will completely change when our children will understand financial systems, like that game you showed me earlier about sort of how you can sort of play and learn about financial systems. I mean, we can teach our kids algebra. We should teach them about interest rates and compound interest and why you shouldn't take credit cards. Credit card debt and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I want to talk about education first, but I want to get back to this Web 2.5 issue because you don't like Web 2.5. And I want to go deeper on that because you just touched on it and it's important. 12 years ago, I quit my job in finance and I started a YouTube channel. And I wanted to have conversations with people. I didn't really know what I was doing. But I realized I was actually turning into an educator because, like you said, most people go to YouTube to learn something.
Yes.
And funny enough, a lot of people are going to TikTok lately to learn stuff. Like it's a lot more learning going on than you might think. And so how do I do this is one of the things that people want to know on YouTube. And so unbeknownst to me, I soon became an educator, and we were democratizing information that you just couldn't find anywhere. And the mainstream media would never have some of the weirdos I've had on my show. I think you'll qualify as a weirdo too. And so, we were at the forefront of democratizing information in the Web 2 sense, and it was just amazing for me to watch. And it's weird how we put a lot of people on the map because we had them on the show 10 years ago and would sit down for these long conversations that were highly educational. And so I got into this space not by intention. And so I started to learn a little bit more about the space. And if you talk to anybody who's been onboarded into the crypto space in the last few years, most of them will say, I locked myself in a room and I watched YouTube videos. Dan Tapiero said this. He runs Tenti Holdings. He's an investor in you guys. Exactly. And he's amazing. And he was on one of my Academy calls the other night, and he said, I locked myself in a room for 6 months and watched all the videos. Michael Saylor, who owns billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin, said he did the same thing in 2020, and he watched a bunch of my videos with Andreas Antonopoulos that I had on the show back in 15 and 17. And so I learned a lot about education. I just want to say a couple things that I learned is that I later created an academy where I would teach via Zoom, even 8 years ago, people to learn things and then to take action and fulfill assignments. And I learned one thing about digital education, and I still haven't seen anyone, except maybe you guys, crack it in this space, and I want to see where it goes. But I learned that you need content and you need community as well. And this is something that I think a lot of platforms have missed. And I'm not going to point fingers, but sometimes you go to like Udemy and you can get a course for $7. And the problem is nobody finishes those courses. And what I've found is that you have to create a community, which I guess is culture. And then you have to be creating content, not just the education, but content seems to matter as well.
Absolutely.
To complement that. And then, of course, some type of accountability that probably comes with community. And it's something that I think is still missing from our digital education out there. And I'm still waiting for someone to crack it, especially in this space. We spent the last couple of years teaching people in crypto and DeFi, and we've done an amazing job, but it's hard to scale because I'm creating, these micro communities. And it works really well, and we pull people from all over the world and they feel like they're family. But the person or group that cracks that, and I'd love to help out in some way, is going to find a way to bring all these things together.
I think we can look at AI as a very interesting tool for that as well, because there is a sort of correlation between the quality of education and the sort of customization of education to the individual, in terms of how you basically get towards not just better economic circumstances and broader GDP improvements and so on, but also in terms of the attention that you get. And you can't scale that in a school. So you go to a more expensive school where you can basically have one teacher and 5 kids or 8 kids. But most people are in ratios of like 25, 30, or maybe even 50, depending on which country you are, or maybe even hundreds, right? And it's just harder. And so it's more about sort of how you learn and so on. It's also typically content that's not interactive. So AI definitely plays a role in this. But AI can only, I think, customize up to a certain point, because the content is still individualized, because we are diverse people. Right? I mean, we can see this in our families, right? I have 3 kids, they're completely different, all 3 of them, right? The way they grew up, the circumstances in which they grew up, almost identical. In fact, they even went to the first school, same school in the beginning. And yet, They are three entirely different persons that are unrecognizable other than from the look that they're from the family in terms of their interests or what they do. Right? And I think this is not a story of just us. I think it's a story of everyone. So we're incredibly diverse people. That means not everyone learns exactly the same way. And that's what's one of the big challenges that we have in schools. Because in schools, we have a teacher that teaches you one way, not because the teacher isn't capable, but he or her has his own way of expressing it, whether they're visual or verbal, whatever it is. And so the cohort of kids inside the class that understands this teacher well, they do well. But the other cohort that doesn't understand it at all, they're like, I don't know what this is, or I can't interpret it as well. But the difference in the system like that, those that are left out, they, even though they have the sort of ability, start to feel stupid. And it impacts also their self-esteem, and it impacts their sort of thinking as to what they could do. And then they get put into this box of, you're not that good. Because, in reality, what probably happened is that the way that teacher was teaching you just didn't speak to you because people just learn differently. And you see this with famous stories about, geniuses in the world like Einstein. I mean, I think the story is that Einstein was a terrible, terrible, terrible student, according to his teacher. But, look at that, right? So I think there is that element there, that teachers making more content and getting a sort of also more income. See, that's the other thing. If a teacher actually makes more value and more income into space, well, guess what happens? They will enter the job, right? Instead, because it's such a poorly paid job, unfortunately, it ends up becoming the last option in many cases. And that's not a good outcome. You don't want the last option to be the one teaching, teaching your kids, right? Also, I think education from a formation standpoint is actually one of the most important ways in which we distribute values and ideas, right? In the age of AI, information broadly is not what you should be teaching. It should be these things that matter to us as people, because information is at our fingertips anyway, right? You just need to know how to use tools. Whether it's a version of OpenAI, ChatGPT, whether it's something else, there's going to be thousands and thousands of AI tools are springing up. And with TinyTap, what they're doing is that teachers create content. Eventually, that kind of content will also be translated into AIs that can extract sort of the essence of this content, and then basically create some interesting content that is maybe customized for one student or the other. Like, all of this stuff is eventually going to happen anyway, right? So we'll have this kind of content that is broadly available, and we can have access to that. So what is it then that we should be teaching our kids? It's not going to be how you can learn math better or how you can memorize history dates better. It's going to be much more fundamental than that, right? And so one of the things that I think is going to be important about values, or whether it's philosophy or whether it's concepts, things that make us human, and also things that sort of identify with, I think, what makes us naturally human, which is creativity. One of the things, there's this interesting study that was performed in the 60s by Beth Jarman and George Land. And this was a famous study at the time, because they would normally make the study for kids who went to, not for kids, for NASA research scientists. And the whole idea was, can I see how divergent, how creative you are in solving problems? Because certainly when you're NASA and you're sending people to space, when there's a problem, that problem has never happened before. So you need someone who is very, very divergent to be able to solve the problem. But this test, right, which basically was a version that helped to identify whether there were good NASA research scientists that were divergent in their approaches, they did a version of that for children. And they followed those children from the age of 5 to 15, and then they did the same test to adults who were at the age of 21. The kids that were 5 years old were able to solve a problem divergently, as in creatively, 98% of the time. By the time they were 10 years old, take a guess roughly what the percentage was.
By the time they were 10?
Yes, or 8 or 10. Well, anyway, a few years into
down to 80 or something?
30. 30%. By the time they were teenagers, it was something like maybe 10, 12%, and the adults scored an amazing 2%. Wow. And the conclusion that came from that, which was the body of a lot of other people's works as well, was that schools actually educate us out of creativity. That we as humans are actually born creatively, and the systems in place actually destroy the creativity aspect because it wasn't welcome. Now that makes sense, because from an educational standpoint, the Victorian school system wasn't there to create creative people who are disruptive, who are maybe destructive in some of their ideas because they're too creative. You want people who have order and who behave, right? So we have to make sure that they follow instructions. So you turn them into robots. And that's basically what the education system hasn't emerged from in many places. There's some exceptions, like when you look at the Finnish education system, which emphasizes empathy and so on. That's sort of an example of something that's progressive. But generally speaking, we still force our kids to memorize dates and do things.
Montessori schools?
Well, Montessori is different. Montessori is definitely much more on the creative side and much more on the sort of empathy side. But Montessori is basically a kindergarten program, right? For most people. Then, unfortunately, when you think about college placements and that kind of stuff, they have to bring you into a conventional program. And that basically means you start to sort of go in a completely different direction that may be not positive for your creativity. Whereas I remember, decades ago when we were having these debates, people said, I can teach you creativity, right? I mean, maybe you can enhance creativity that is in there, but you can't teach creativity because that's innate in us. We all have different creative ideas and we can evolve from that. And this to me is also the saving grace about things about AI, because I don't think AI is creative in that sense. It can create creative outputs. What you see with Midjourney and Stability, amazing stuff they can do. But who are they creating it for? Who is deriving pleasure from the work that AI makes? The AI? It's humans. And who says, hey, this is beautiful? Not the AI. Humans, right? So in other words, this outcome, this output is a value that is still our creativity, our root, our source. So I believe, for instance, that what happens with AI is that it enhances and brings out more of what we already have inside us because we can explore it deeper and faster. For instance, I can run through images in Midjourney at a pace and speed that I wouldn't be able to do, and then I get broader, better ideas that simply appeal to me. I don't believe it's a case of the AI is influencing me as to what I should like, because actually the opinion is still mine, right? When I'm eating something, if someone makes some food, it's still my taste. You might like it, I might not like it, right? And we see this. You show one picture, you give 10 people to look at this picture, they will all rate it differently. They're not going to say, we all like this, we all prefer this one, because we're different, right? So I think at the end of the day, I think if we keep that at root and we consider who we are as creative species, then actually I think we have a lot of, we will have a productive relationship with our AIs because it unlocks creativity, as the calculator did literally in the most primitive form, 30, 40 years ago, unlocking people's creativity because, math became a commodity. Now we're able to do this in a much more super scale level, right? So I think that's a powerful thing. I would also close with this thought, though, that it is critical, though, that we own a piece of this AI. And how do we own it? This is where digital property rights comes in, because our data is actually what fuels the AI. So we must have a paradigm in which you can own that. There's a famous example where Getty Images sued the creators of Stability AI. And they sued them because they could tell that their images were used to train their learning models. But how? Because they forgot to remove the Getty Images watermark, so which was probably sloppy. But most people won't have a watermark to spot. So what is that fingerprint watermark system? It's on-chain dynamics. It's Web3.
Yeah, that was the perfect example of a lack of digital property rights, right? Because you had a real output that was changing the world, but that learned on other people's data, and luckily the Getty watermark spit out, and you could see an example. But how many other examples were there? Countless.
There's probably millions of cases in which there was infringement that you have absolutely no idea, because how do you do that, right? How do you spot what the source is?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and I think this is where why you need to have your assets on chain is so critical. The other thing is that on-chain dynamics proves in a copyright / trademark kind of way that you were the original source of that idea, right? Which means all sorts of things that you're creating actually are able to have this timestamp through NFTs that you can immortalize as a way of saying, I did this first, or I had this idea. Originality and authenticity is going to be much more important than necessarily the ability to produce something really beautiful.
Right. And then the ability for us to track that will actually create bigger economies.
Absolutely.
Which is what you go back to America. If you have real property rights, it expands the economy. When you have this nebulous uncertainty, it actually doesn't.
Well, think about intellectual property rights. One of the reasons why America became the innovation powerhouse in the world is because they were one of the first countries in the world to truly protect and defend intellectual property rights. It wasn't just physical property rights. Right. They acknowledged invention. Now, there are other countries in the world, most notably places like China. They only started to respect intellectual property rights really in the 80s, and it happened very slowly. But then, when they finally started doing it in the mid-80s, actually and then eventually progressing much more so in the 90s, that's when you had intellectual property rights development. Up until then, what was the Greater China region? A haven for piracy. Everyone was copying stuff. In fact, copying was considered a form of flattery. There was no way of protecting it. Software, like fake Microsoft Office and like Windows 95 or whatever it was, or like Windows DOS or whatever, is simply everywhere that you could find, right? Like I don't know if you went to Hong Kong in the 90s, but you could literally walk in broad daylight into a store and go buy pirated software, right? And in the beginning, it might seem like a good deal because, American innovation, you can get it for free in China or in Hong Kong. But what was the downside? No software industry in China and Hong Kong. Why would you do it? Then no innovation, no development, and oops, you're falling behind. And they recognize that. So they reverse course, and to the point where, now China is probably is a bigger producer of patents than the United States, right? But that thing has to happen first. So this intellectual property right is effectively how we could also think of somewhat data rights as well. If you have that right, new possibilities come about because you now have the ability to value it.
Animoca has a bunch of metaverse companies, not all, but a lot. Your engineers are probably using AI to build quicker, better metaverses as we speak.
Absolutely. Yes.
How is that going to impact them on the short run? They always say the calculator or the tractor is just going to make more effective workers. But at some point, will it mean that some people won't be doing that job anymore as far as animators, creators?
I think that the skill changes, right? Like in the same way that when new tools came about, you just had to know how to use these new tools, right? So if you don't upgrade your skills or change the dimension in which you're working in, then obviously you will become obsolete, right? That's the nature of broadly work all over the world, right? I mean, whether you're farming, whether you're driving, whether you do whatever, these type of jobs, unfortunately, sort of, and we have some collective responsibility to help people on board in that area. But one of the things that we're seeing with AI, particularly when you think about art production, as you mentioned, is that it doesn't replace the artist. It enhances his work. Because the artist no longer has to sketch and draw. He can actually conceptualize and say, okay, here's a prompt. This is what I'm looking at. Give me some ideas. Whether he then evolves those ideas and has to touch it up at the end just means that he's able to do things much faster and quicker. Because now he ends up being able to work on work much faster. To me, though, this isn't just a case of he's more productive. I think he becomes more creative. Because his output, the more things you see, the better you become. It's not a case of the more things you see and then you're like, oh my goodness, I'm overwhelmed, I can't handle all of this. No. If you actually are able, with your whatever capacity you're able to process, maximize that, then you're basically able to review information much, much faster. You make better decisions when you have more data, but you have a problem when the data is illegible or is something that you have to explore. In art, for instance, creating the information is the output. Once I make the output, then I show it to people and they say, I like it, I don't like it, I want this change. That part used to take days per piece of art, maybe even weeks, depending on what you're doing, and now it can be done in minutes, right? Which means that we can start reviewing work in much faster ways. We can come to decisions much faster. That doesn't mean we're less creative. Maybe it means that we're no longer as skilled with the pen, shall we say. But that's true for people who type as well. I mean, some people like to sort of use their hands to write, and it's a nice skill and it's beautiful and everything. But if you want to compete with someone who's using a keyboard versus someone who's using ink to write, well, I'm sorry, I'm not, it's pretty obvious who's going to win, right? Because the difference between writing with your hand versus using a keyboard has no direct output in terms of your productivity. In fact, it has an impact on productivity. The one who uses a keyboard just has faster output versus the one who uses the pen and paper, right? It doesn't make you more creative because you have a pen and paper. So I think with AI, it's exactly the same paradigm.
I spoke with an incubator here in London. He's actually going to be on the show next week, and he said something that blew my mind. He said, Brian, I think I've seen the next single founder, single employee unicorn. He said, we introduced a stack of about 10 AI pieces, and now they write employment contracts, they do the marketing, they do the branding, it builds the website. And I said, what did you say? And he said, I think I've seen a few. These will become unicorns this year. He said, maybe even this year. And I was like, wow, I hadn't thought of that before.
So while it is possible in this paradigm, I don't think it's possible long-term. Because if you can have a single person unicorn, it means everyone can build a unicorn, right? The inspiration and the tools built around this is not simply based on a commodity, but because you have an advantage of being first in that commodity. Like it's like, for instance, if you were one of the very first app developers in 2011 or 2010, you just have a natural advantage, like us. You have a natural advantage, right? If you're one of the first people to build e-commerce websites in 1998 or 99, you have a natural advantage, right? So certainly you weren't able to do it as a one-man show, but you were ahead of the game. But eventually what happens is that if a one-man band, right, which you had with the App Store, you had literally, not one man, but you had like very few men startups, shall we say. I mean, look at WhatsApp. How big was WhatsApp when it sold for billions of dollars to, or Instagram? I think Instagram was maybe $1 billion or $1.5 billion, and I think the team was 14 people, for instance.
Yeah,
right?
I think it was 15 people.
Yeah, exactly, right? So that paradigm isn't unheard of, but to me, that's just a moment in time, right? Because there's plenty of smart people that would come with narratives and versions of this. So to me, the human element then comes towards a differentiation, because at the end, the data models themselves, I don't think that those are going to be exclusive, right? Particularly in a decentralized fashion, right? You have ways in which you have access to the same knowledge, right? If you're, for instance, using OpenAI, we're all building on the same framework. If you're using OpenAI, for instance, that doesn't mean you have an advantage because you have access to something that someone else doesn't have. You all have the same access. So the human creativity unlocks potential, but everyone's using the same resources. So again, I don't think this is a sustainable long-term example.
I think it was also the idea that maybe an artist for the first time doesn't need also to have a coder and
Correct.
have a legal person.
So
and
that's
all
different.
This,
yeah.
To where they can actually, take everything in that brain and potentially create $1 billion company because they have all these AI assistants.
Correct. So I think that that area is going to happen where you have many more companies, where you might have a definition, or what is an SME? Maybe we have to sort of maybe S is no longer sort of small, maybe it's single, right?
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays.
Yes.
I mentioned earlier, Web 2.5 to Web 3. I've heard you say that it's important that people learn Web 3 because they have a real relationship with their money. They understand their money.
Yes.
And I'm a fan of this. This is what our academy does. I mean,
yes.
people have to get wallets.
Yes.
I actually force my students to use Uniswap, to yield farm. I even have forced them to buy an option on crypto because I want them
yes.
to understand the financial instruments.
Yes.
But at the same time, some of our investments at London Real Ventures are companies that bring your grandma into the metaverse without her having to have the MetaMask wallet yet. And so she goes into a social digital experience, owns digital property, without having to necessarily go to OpenSea and understand that. So I'm curious how you feel about those two worlds, because I'm sure you see pros in both.
Yeah, I do. I don't have, just to clarify, I don't have an objection to Web 2.5. It's just a lot of people who have come to us to talk about Web 2.5, is that they want to make money like Web 3, because the capital formation and value is just so incredible, like an example I give with NFTs. But they want to control like Web 2.
Okay.
And that's where I have an issue. So the typical question is, are you Web 2.7 or are you Web 2.3? Like, which part of the equation are you sitting on, right? The fact that we need an onboarding experience that actually helps people migrate is necessary. And maybe you need to, like what skeuomorphism did in early sort of interface designs for the Apple device, we need a version of that as well, right? How do you bring someone who is sort of in the TradFi world into the DeFi world? If you launch, if you do things like on Uniswap or PancakeSwap or whatever fruit or apple or vegetable swap that you put out, it's going to be totally alien, right? And only a certain kind of culture will understand it. Everyone goes like, "This is weird. Why am I trading bananas for apples?" Or like from their perspective, this seems strange, as it should, because they're unfamiliar. So we need to create some familiar frameworks. I agree with that. But what I don't agree with is that we make them entirely blind to the process. The end result, to be a full Web3 user, must mean that you are now financially sort of literate, right? You cannot be a real Web3 user unless you have financial literacy. The democratization of financial knowledge is a big part of being a true Web3 experience. Otherwise, you end up basically just being a Web2 user that happens to own Web3 assets, right? That's what this is. Because also, as they say, right, not your keys, not your assets, for instance, right? It's exactly the same thing. If they hold your keys, if they have custody of your assets, they actually can take it away, in whichever time that they want, because maybe they don't like your rules or whatever, and you suddenly go back to being, a Web3 version of Web2, where they can use your assets and they can maybe utilize them in manners that you don't approve. I mean, that's what happened with FTX. right? If you think about it, right? I mean, people gave FTX assets and they started trading them because they had custody of them, right? And you will know this is terribly illegal, but the problem is that we can't control that because we no longer have custody and sovereignty over them. And as an end user, you need to know the difference between the two. And unfortunately in Web2, we have trained billions of people that convenience of access is the primary benefit, which I very much disagree with. Because if you think about gaming, the number of times that you start a new game, you go through tutorial, that's like 10 minutes, 15 minutes, sometimes it's hours. And at the end, you're not just entertained, you learned a new skill. Maybe you learned, how a weapon works, or maybe you learned about how to build a house, or maybe you learned something, but you learned something new. And this to me is a superpower of good game design, that you can motivate people in a gamified way to learn a new skill. And to me, I think that should be, as part of that should be financial onboarding, financial education, knowing what value is, because then I think the world will change. Because, if now billions of people have similar knowledge about financial systems, that to me becomes the antidote for financial abuse. Financial abuse happens because one party knows something that the other part doesn't, right? We had information abuse in Web 1, where someone sold you something or did a deal with you because he knew he would make 99% margins on this, because he knew a buyer on the other side, and you had no idea because the internet didn't exist. You didn't have Alibaba, or you didn't have Amazon or eBay. So value was intermediated and taken advantage of in really terrible ways. To stop that in the financial world, we must have broad financial knowledge.
Yeah, I think Gary Gensler called it information asymmetry.
Yes.
That's when he was teaching at MIT, and he was pro-crypto back then. But yeah, I'm a big fan of that, and I agree with you completely. Again, just looping back to your education narrative, I mean, one of the things we aren't taught in school is we're not taught about money.
No, not at all.
And
it's a scandal, if you ask me. I think it's scandalous that we don't teach money in school when money is one of the core infrastructures, if not the core infrastructure, that sort of we need to understand how it works so we can operate in it. Which means that the small percentage of the world, which is still single-digit percentage, that understands how money and value works, that's why they are in their positions of power.
Yeah, it purely is. And I've had the pleasure of sitting down many times with Robert Kiyosaki, author of Rich Dad, Poor Dad.
Yes.
And, he tells a story. We raise his hand in 8 years old and asks the teacher, when are we going to learn about money? And she says, no, we don't teach money in schools. And again, his real dad, his poor dad, was like head of education in Hawaii. So his whole family is PhD educated in the education. And they said, we don't teach money. He said, you're teaching me Spanish and chemistry and history. Why don't you teach me about money? And they're like, we don't teach this. Yes. And so the reason he wrote that book, and we were looking at the cash flow game, is because he was trying to find a way to educate people about money.
Yes.
He did it through storytelling, interesting enough, but we need to do it through definitely the gamification. And
more broadly, more broad.
We have to get people there. And I look at it because I spent my early education not learning about money, and then later I forced myself to learn about money in business school and then on Wall Street. And I could literally see how we're taught like you're not smart enough to understand money.
Oh, yes.
Just like we were taught you're not smart enough to understand your health,
yes,
or you're not smart enough to understand all these other things. And we're all starting to wake up to the fact that, wait a second, when we outsource our health or outsource our money to other people, it can, and oftentimes in a matter of time, will be abused. And
it will be abused because they have power over you in matters, and you don't have a way. It's another form of self-custody, or another form of sort of, do I own sort of my own narrative in this sense, right? This is what happened to my mother. She was an artist, she was a musician. And basically intermediaries would say, you worry about being an artist and be creative because that's what you're good at. I'll worry about the money, okay? But unfortunately, they would abuse it. And to the point where she would have no idea what happened almost, right? I mean, and because it happened to every artist, suddenly it became the norm. It was okay to underpay musicians and artists, which is frankly to the detriment of society, right? Because you don't have that much diversity and so on. So I think this is a really, really important part. And I think it is a failing in the system. But I think part of the failing in the system has not just to do with control, but also has to do with the fact that in certain cultures, talking about money was considered uncool. It was considered something rude, right? And I remember, because I grew up in Europe, I grew up in Austria, in the 70s and 80s, these capitalist Americans would come visit Europe, with their cash, and they would be, considered brash, and the expression to them was like the nouveau riche, right? And many, many people in Europe would look down on them and just, they wouldn't necessarily say it to their face, but they were like, oh, these Americans, whatever. but yet they had the money and the power, and they came to study and learn, right? But effectively, it was this sort of looking down that has held back society in these places because of this sort of, sort of objection to value and money, which is ironic, because at the end of the day, you get paid this for your better standards of living or whatever it is, what it is. By the way, this is the worrying narrative that's happening in America, right? Because in America, people used to say, okay, capitalism is good, we have to work hard to get there. And while there is definitely inequity that needs to be solved, what I think is far more dangerous and insidious is this idea that capitalism actually isn't a force for good. Because if we don't have capitalism, then we won't have innovation, and we won't have the incentive mechanisms to push the world forward in a positive way.
And that is a fact. Fast forward 20 years, if Animoca does its job, what does the world look like?
Well, I mean, the first big hope for me is that there will be a different level of distribution of income and value because everyone becomes a stakeholder, right? So that means that we get to own a piece in the networks that we participate and that we help grow. Not all of us will necessarily succeed in the same way, but just imagine, mental model, obviously that's not the case today. Every person who uses Facebook has a stake in Facebook. They would share in its value. That to me is much more effective than UBI, where someone has to pay someone the same value. I understand the ideas of UBI and I appreciate its noble intentions, but I don't think that's how humans work, right? That's sort of the idea of, ultra-socialism, perhaps even veering slightly towards a communist framework, where everyone at least gets, sort of the same, regardless of what you do. Whereas here, it's still based on your effort. If you could create good data, or if you create sort of good contributions, you are generally rewarded more, but you still get to participate in the distribution of that value. Because I think what's unfair isn't the fact that there's inequity. I think inequity is necessary in some ways for economic systems to flourish because you need to have ambitions and drivers. But what I actually think has failed is shareholder capitalism as a concentration of wealth, because you can't participate. If you're an employee or if you're a participant in a network, you have no way in participating in the growth of that. Who has participated? Investors and founders of the company, possibly employees. Everyone else doesn't participate, right? Even though they helped grow that network. You made a viral video and Instagram or TikTok gained like millions of new users because of it. That didn't happen because you don't own a piece of that, right? You don't own a sort of part of that network effect, right? So to me, when that changes, all of us will then have sort of income that's derived from it, freeing us up. So I feel like it may have maybe a similar effect of what we want UBI to do, but in relative terms, and because we're refining our data and experiences as we feed in the systems. Because at the end of the day, the AI grows from our human experiences. It doesn't grow from AI experiences, right? The AI still serves our purposes. We are delighted in human ways about what AI makes. The AI doesn't sort of say, wow, this is great art, or that tastes really good, or oh, I feel sadness for this.
Not yet.
Right? Well, I mean, even then, it's an artificial construction of this one, where in comparison to what an AI does, which is the one, and a human does, which is, where that source of empathy and feeling and emotions truly comes from. Right? So I think at the end of the day, that's what's going to change. And also, in hopefully sooner than 20 years, we're going to have billions of people be financially educated, meaning we have a base level of financial literacy. So there's going to be a few things that happens. One, there's going to be less abuses, because when you have broad information symmetry, then the level of abuse becomes a social protection level. Right now, you have to have regulators come in to basically enforce it, because why do you have to enforce it? Because there's a gap, right? But for instance, other concepts like you shall not steal, or other concepts about sort of fraud, or even things that you would sort of spread misinformation to some degree, the paradigm, right? So you can't really get away with that type of stuff, because socially we all understand that this is wrong, right? But when it comes to financial exploitation, we don't know. Even if it is wrong, we don't know it because we don't understand it. So that's the thing that I think happens, and it requires a generation of children as well to come in through the education system, which we hope things like Open Campus and TinyTap can also help contribute to. So maybe in 10 years' time, hopefully, we'll have such a broad knowledge of information sort of symmetry that we will no longer have these abuses. Credit card companies can no longer charge you 20% interest, but still, again, how is that even possible in this world, right? And why do people even sign up for that, right? And then separately, of course, I think it changes the liquidity profile of the market. When you see what happened with Web 1, information becoming so broadly available, what did it do? It created and spawned much bigger industries, much bigger opportunities, because everyone had more based knowledge and therefore more ability to express their creative individuation and ideas because they had more information, right? The more you know, the more you can create. And this to me means, in the financial context, much deeper liquidity, much broader sort of levels of transaction that become much bigger in the world, meaning that the digital plane will, as a result, become this, trillions and trillions of dollars market size, as opposed to the billions that it is today.
Right, and then continue to grow and
Exactly.
grow and grow and grow.
Yeah.
Downside of the future, I guess you don't want to see closed metaverses or closed AIs or closed anything.
I would say that the closed metaverse, as we had spoken a few years ago, seems to have already sort of, when you look at what happened to Facebook, I think is a perfect illustration how closed metaverses simply can't work that well.
Right.
Part of the reason is because of the economic opportunities that take place in an open metaverse. You can't compete, right? The take rate of a platform and the cost of gas is single-digit percentages of the value you generate. Why would you ever sort of share half of your value or 2/3 of your value to a platform? But the reason that the platform has to charge that, because remember, Facebook is paying billions of dollars a year to keep the system going, is because they have to recreate an entire infrastructure that basically blockchain has already built, right? And the Web3 infrastructure is not maintained by a single entity that has to tax you. It's maintained by the entire community in a capitalist framework, I would add, right, in terms of the reward mechanism, that sustains a system where we all contribute to its network. So when you pay gas, you're keeping the network alive and you're maintaining the health of the network where every user pays. Imagine, again, if you look at Instagram and Facebook, and if we're willing to pay a small fee for each transaction we do there, its business model will change. For starters, we wouldn't have advertising, for instance. Right. We'd have completely different business models, which is exactly what we're seeing in the Web3 paradigm. So that's one. But I think the bigger worry to me at this point wouldn't be about the closed metaverse, because I think that sort of is starting to look very obvious if you look at what happened to Meta. To me, I think if you were to put out a concern is, the closed systems are, AI is building on, for instance, is that we don't know what's inside those systems. And we don't fully understand it, right? And these aren't open enough for us to sort of build on top of. To me, the paradigm of the digital property rights feeding into these AIs isn't something that can only be solved technologically. I do think they need to be solved in a kind of governmental regulatory framework, because this is even more important to make sort of digital property rights as real as physical property rights, not because smart contracts and blockchain can prove it, but also that it is in law, right? And I think this is the part where I think we need to sort of evolve quicker, because AI is feeding all of this information and we have no way of tracking it, at least to the external person. But I would also say, I go back to this early thing. As you know, I'm an optimist, right? Clearly. In the earlier conversation, sort of, I mentioned how when there's a problem in technology finds a way to solve itself towards these problems, right? In the way that Web 2 and Web 3 and blockchain, that kind of stuff happen in other areas of technology. I think the same will happen. If there's an AI that's abusive, a new AI will emerge that will kind of solve it, or have another framework that will do that. And it won't solve it because the AI becomes sentient and says, oh, we need to solve this. It solves it because we as people want to solve it. We as humans don't want the world to go under. We don't want chaos. We want to help others. Right? At the end of the day, we exist in a cordial fashion. Maybe there's a few bad actors, or maybe you get greedy because you have too much power, but broadly speaking, society is put together not because of a military force that says behave, but because we as people socially want to be, for simply the survival of our species, are driven by a cordial manner that basically ensures our survival to make things positive and better for everyone, I think. And as a result, when there is a negative thing that happens, an antidote will come that will be technological in its approach, but will be because humans want it to happen, not because we want sort of a nihilistic future in which we all sort of terminate. But that's what nobody wants.
I appreciate you saying that. Sometimes it's hard to remember when you see people fighting away on social. Just wanted to finish with a personal question. I mean, I saw you 6 weeks ago in Paris. Then you followed me to Texas. And now you're here in London. I know in between you went to Buenos Aires, you went to Rio de Janeiro, and now you're off to Paris again, and you're just touring the globe.
Yes.
First of all, how do you do that? Why do you do that? And what is communication like your most important role as the head of Animoca?
I mean, as chairman, obviously, I have broad responsibilities. I have an excellent team that's helping me with a lot of things, and we're a much larger institution and organization than we were, say, even a year ago, for instance, right? So in that sense, I think, I'm able to travel and do this type of stuff. But the mission is just so important, right? And one of the reasons why I think, particularly last year, you will notice that our engagements externally have actually accelerated.
Yeah.
Is because the world needed to have the true narrative of what Web3 and the open metaverse was all about. Because people were equating the space with the bad actors. The crypto Wall Street guys basically ended up ruining the market for us a little bit, and people couldn't determine the difference when it's such an important and transformational technology for, frankly, everyone in the world, particularly when you think about where AI is going. Digital property rights is foundational. And so we felt it was like a duty for us to go out and basically tell that. So I'm driven by that because I think I may have mentioned this in our earlier talks, right? What we're building is bigger than us, right? What we're helping construct, it's a purpose much, much more important than simply just for me or even the company, right? Where Web3 and digital property rights has to go is a foundation for, the rights for everyone, right? And that purpose, and I think this is true for any company or any individual that feels this way, then you are able to do what may seem crazy or may seem, there are clearly sacrifices. I don't get to spend as much time with my family. I don't get to see my friends the way that I used to. I spend a lot of time talking to people. But I get energy as well because I know that the work I'm doing is positive, right? So there's obviously a positive feedback loop. But also because I know that the work is so important, I'm prepared to do it. And I think in that sense, I feel blessed because I have a purpose that is so important that I believe in, and I think it's so important to the world, that I'm able to spend time in that manner. So many people, unfortunately, get to work on things that they don't believe in. They just do it for a paycheck. And while it may give them a certain kind of life, and maybe they don't have to travel, I don't know that it gives them really the satisfaction that they crave. And unfortunately, I think we still have a lot of people who can't do that. But I think, again, Web3 and AI and sort of the ability to express it creatively actually will hopefully unlock that for a lot more people.
You said you feel energy. Do you feel energy from humanity sometimes?
I do.
Coming back towards you?
Absolutely. I feel it because it's like a vibe. It's very hard to express in terms of, people come and, of course, some people come and pitch, right? And say, hey, I have I want to invest and whatever. Sure, that happens too. But there's a lot of people who come up and just simply say, I want to say thank you, or I want to take a photo with you, or whatever. These are small little things that actually are positive feedback loops. In the real world, we don't get that enough in other areas of work that we do, right? We just go to work, we do our thing, we might talk to a few people, but we don't have a way in which we can express the gratitude that we do to each other, right? And I think, in the work that we do, because everything we do, we feel is positive and is building to a positive effect, that energy, that positive feedback loop comes to us and we feed off that as an organization. That's also how we sustain our energy, I think. And it's not just me. I mean, it may seem externally that, yes, I'm traveling all over the world and so on. But, I'm not the one signing deals or closing this or making these deals. I think we were considered the largest or second largest investor in the Web3 space last year. We made the most M&A acquisitions last year. That's a team. That team works crazy hard. Why? Because they also believe in the mission and the purpose of what's being built. You can't have the kind of outcome. I mean, for instance, the launch of the EDU token most recently, right, is an incredible result, with $1 billion FTV, driving value for teachers and educators around the world in what's supposed to be a bear market, right? You don't just do this because you're lucky. Luck may have a sort of part to play, but it comes because of dedication and hard work, and that people are doing it and willing to sort of burn midnight hours because of the midnight oil, because you really want this to happen, right? So I think we're blessed because we really believe that, and we think we're making a big impact.
Yeah, it shows. It really shows. That's a compliment.
Thank you.
And everybody talks about you. They're like, wow, how does Yat do it? How is he always in such a good mood? How does he have time for everybody? How is he always here doing all these things? I mean, it's, I say it and everybody says it. So it's noticed, and obviously it's backed up by your team. And we've had Robbie on the show as well. You're an incredible CEO, and I know a bunch of other members of your team, and they all have that that transformational mission energy, you know,
Right.
and that's a beautiful place to work. And
Yes.
you're right, you are lucky to have that because
Yes.
some people don't. Do you think the fight for digital property rights is the most important fight of the human species?
I would definitely consider it as foundational, because if you don't have property rights, you can't have freedom. And that is the part that I think is just maybe hard for some people to explain if they don't get it. But once you dig deeper into it, once you not just go into the philosophy, but into actuals, really at root, you know, what property rights does also is it decentralizes power. It gives power to the individual so they can keep the other side in check, right? It's an accountability framework. That's the democratic framework, right? And you know, what we see with DAOs, for instance, is fascinating because with DAOs, we're now able to elect or do votes on a weekly basis. Eventually, you can do this on a daily basis, perhaps even if it makes sense. Collective decision-making at scale. The reason why physical democratic systems can't work this way is because you need paperwork. I need to prove, are you Brian that's coming in and signing on and making that vote? I have to verify. That framework is expensive to prove because otherwise someone can just, you know, hire a bunch of people to come in and pretend they're people that don't exist, for instance, right? So you need that. On-chain will solve for a lot of that. So it means that I actually think Web3 and blockchain will create a much more democratic society over time as we begin to understand and respect that particular process. So I think it's it's absolutely foundational because then that's the way in which you can defend your property rights because it's now held in a democratic framework. In the same way that if I mint something on Ethereum, I can't just take it away. I need the consensus of the network to say, maybe that shouldn't be yours, right? How do I obtain that consensus? Right? I have to convince, I have to explain, I have to do all that kind of stuff. And if it turns out, not to work, then, there's a form of justice that just took place that is upheld by the community rather than necessarily just by sort of a handful of people. If we don't solve for property rights in law, for instance, not just in technology, I think what blockchain does is it provides a way in which provenance can be secured. So now we have the framework in which we can actually say, this is yours. Just in the same way that if someone stole your Bitcoin, now in law, people will say, you have to return that. It's stolen Bitcoin. We acknowledge its property. So what's the next step? The broader data framework, not just NFTs, but the broader data framework has to become a property right. So we're inching towards that way. And when we get to that point, I think it redraws everything. Because then AI companies have to basically say where they got their property from. The AI company will say, I can't track all this data, or I can't know where it is because they just picked it up on the web. Well, now on-chain, I know exactly where you picked it up from, and I can start sort of audit that in an automatic transactional manner. One of the big things about blockchain is that the audit trail and the ability to do this in real time is part of its magic. Whereas right now, it's a private database, which frankly you can fudge. So I don't know what's happening in this database, and it's all messy. And by the time a third-party person comes in, they don't even know what was created out of that. Again, I think something that is effectively a public database that is for public review and public audit, which basically blockchain is, will solve that.
Yeah, I think it probably is the most important fight for humanity.
Yes.
And if you look back over the last couple hundred years and count up the hundreds of millions of deaths in this world, like how many of those could have been prevented if there were property rights, if there was transparency, if there was a lack of information asymmetry, as Gary would say, if there was all of that, you could probably stack up many of those would have been saved.
Yes,
so it's important. I'm in the process right now of finishing I think it's our 6th feature-length documentary film that chronicles about 28 days in 2020 when I was being censored by YouTube. And it's called We Will Not Be Silenced. And it kind of goes through my whole process of from bewilderment to anger to fighting back to peace, of basically being forced to create my own community, create my own digital platform to get communications out to the people. It's actually a Web3 ad in disguise, if I really think about it. And it's interesting because I have to watch my old vlog videos. And I was in the old studio that you were in, and I was walking around these roundabouts, sometimes the only person on the street, recording these vlogs and talking about how I felt. But I felt energy coming back to me too at that time, because even though I was pretty much all alone, I felt like I was doing something important, and I felt like a lot of people wanted me to do it.
Yes.
So there is something about that energy that maybe the freshmen at MIT would disagree that even exists. But now that I'm a little older, I'm like, there's something about it.
There's absolutely something about it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's powerful. And I just say for anybody out there, if you're on the right mission, that will come your way, and it'll make you look as young as Yat Siu.
Thank you so much.
And as fresh as this man here. So look, this is incredible. Thank you for the time. Thank you for these conversations.
Thank you for having me.
I implore anybody, if they don't really understand digital property rights, just to go deeper and just to think, well, why can something digital change the world or be the most important fight? But if you really understand that, you'll understand what we're talking about and maybe understand what the future is all about. So,
maybe a closing thought, particularly, not to say that you need to follow this model, but I do think that some of the highlights of the American Constitution is actually very, very informative. We don't study this, for instance, in Europe, for instance, right? When I grew up, we didn't study the American Constitution. Well, we didn't study the French Revolution, but we generally didn't really sort of go deeper in that. And I think the American Constitution is a very interesting sort of work, because America is perhaps the only country in the world that treasures the Constitution in an almost religious manner. Like, it's something you don't change. And it has maintained the country the way it is, the framework that it is. And that is powerful, because think of how old the Constitution is. Yes, there's been some amendments, but how old the principles of the Constitution is, and it still works today. So I think there's something human about this. There's something that we crave for, that it has identified in whichever imperfect ways, and tries to translate that. And the framework of property rights is what America is built on. I mean, you can say maybe you should read, Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, maybe you don't understand John Locke. That's a bit too academic, almost. Like, I wouldn't, unless you're into that, you may not go there. But the Constitution, I think, is a good parallel. You just watch a YouTube video about the framework of what makes the Constitution work, and I think it'll click for most people.
Freedom of speech and right to happiness and all of these things.
I think possibly
property.
maybe the pursuit of happiness, the right to happiness, is perhaps only present possibly in the American Constitution.
I think it is.
Yeah.
I agree. And again, it's almost a reaction to everything that was happening in this country and in Europe that was almost the opposite of that. So you see it through those eyes. And one thing I noticed when you were talking about property rights is property rights are so important, but also the confidence of your future property rights it's
foundational.
It's like the net present value of your property
because
rights.
if you can't have the ownership of it, then you can't predict the future for it. And that's, I think, perhaps the nature of what used to and may still be American optimism. You can see your future. If you can see your future, then you can build towards it, and you're naturally optimistic. If you can't see your future, that's, I think, where trouble begins.
All right, we're ending on that note. Beautiful stuff. Thank you, Yat. Until next time, open invitation. Anytime you're in London, let's do this again.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you so much for what you're doing. I always love watching your talks on stage. I always learn something new about life, about humanness, not to mention Web3. So thank you so much, and wishing you all the best.
Thank you.
All right, till next time. Thanks.